the definition. Using a theory or a concept outside of its original context. An example of that was in your theory borrowing reading about marketing. Marketing is a great field because it's kind of interdisciplinary, right? And it also is very borrowing oriented. So that's why that article, even if you're not in marketing, was a pretty good one. Okay, so how do you do it? Well, here's a series of steps that relate to effective borrowing. And the first step is the one that I've already sort of mentioned. Develop a foundation, to some extent a fairly broad education and experience in multiple domains. There's just absolutely no way around that. That's the funny irony of this interdisciplinary studies program, is that, a lot of people come to it not even knowing what it is, and maybe necessarily wanting to just graduate quickly. But wow, the actual field of interdisciplinary studies does look to have some foundation. That's why they require at least 2 classes in your concentration areas, but requiring 2 classes and having a solid foundation aren't necessarily the same thing. But I'll tell you, classes aside, you could get a foundation. It just requires interest in going out there and exploring some stuff, reading some books on your own, taking a little bit of time, taking a little bit of effort. But unfortunately, that is part of the foundation of interdisciplinary studies, is having that broad education, having some experience in a number of different areas, domains, concentration areas, contexts, whatever you want to call it. Another aspect of that is learning methodologies across those domains. How do people find stuff out? How do people find stuff out in the pure sciences, and how does that differ from how people in the social sciences find stuff out? Because when you start learning about sort of the strengths and weaknesses of the methods that people use in order to come up with these theories and concepts, you begin to get a little bit of insight into how reliable a given theory or concept might be in terms of your desire to borrow it. So what else part of the process? Well, one of the first things you do is you take notice, interdisciplinary level number 1, right? You start making connections. You start developing some analogies. Example of that is marketing versus natural selection. And look at how I've mapped it out here. I've mapped it out just like we mapped out analogies. Objects, properties, relations. Remember that? Objects, properties, relations. Well, what are some objects in natural selection? Well, species is one of the objects. Properties, environmental fit of that species, mutations over time, a number of different properties. I've just listed a few of them. Relationships, survival or extinction. That would be one very elementary way that you could map out, okay, natural selection. How would you map marketing to that? Type of product might be a species. By the way, this is one of many ways that you can map marketing to this metaphor, okay? Type of product, industry, economy, placement of a product. I mean, you name it. There's a lot of different ways. It's not like the right answer. This is just one of many. Type of product as the species. Demand, right? Substitution, substitutes. How a product changes over time, and like mutations, right? What's going on in the marketplace in terms of the kind of product or the kind of company that would most likely survive. The end result, success or failure of the company or product. Survival or extinction of the species. It's kind of the first step in figuring out what kind of things you could borrow. This is really the first step, because the next step is trying to extend that analogy, right? Trying to extend that analogy. Saying, okay, well, I know in natural selection that certain species thrive in certain conditions, and it's better for some species than in others. I wonder if in marketing, certain types of companies survive in certain economic conditions. They're better suited for certain economic conditions than others. What a great question to ask, right? What a great question to ask. And the answer to that question is, yeah, that's given birth to all kinds of theories in marketing about the types of companies that work in certain types of environments. The types of products that work in certain kinds of environments. You can make those same kind of analogies. So interesting, our old friend analogy is back as one of the first steps in borrowing. Okay, again, process. Exploring the nature of the theory being borrowed. Concepts, relationships. If you're going to go ahead and borrow a theory, you ought to know a little bit of something about it. So once you've identified a possible theory to borrow, to use, you're going to want to dig into that theory a little more deeply than maybe you already have. What is the concepts associated with that theory? What are the relationships between those concepts and ideas? What's the social context? In other words, when was this theory developed and why? That's the agendas as well. Hey, who came up with this and why did they come up with it? Because that tells you some things about whether or not you want to borrow it, right? And then to extend the analogy. Like I say, we can map it out, natural selection and marketing, but how do we go deeper? What are the real relationships now at the deep level of natural, of evolution, and how could that relate to marketing? And the deeper that you go, the deeper the connections. If you start seeing these great parallels and these great linkages, then you know you're onto a really good thing to borrow. So the first bullet there really is it appropriate based on what I'm learning about this theory that I want to borrow? And the second is, now let's take it a little bit deeper. Ultimately, when you're borrowing theories, you're going to want to critically reflect on your own assumptions. Why am I borrowing, right? What is it that I hope to accomplish as a result of taking this theory out of its context and using it someplace else? And then the final thing is to get out there and try it out, right? I mean, things on paper are great, but ultimately your use, if you're ever going to get into this idea of borrowing ideas, you're going to have to use them, right? You're going to be a sales manager in an organization, say, and you're going to be reading about this motivational theory that seems really interesting to you, doesn't have anything to do with salespeople, and you're going to evaluate it in those terms, you're going to map it out, you're going to dig a little bit deeper, you're going to come up with some incredible ideas of your own, but ultimately you're going to have to try it out with your people, right? You're going to have to try it out. If you don't, everything's pretty much been a knot, at least from an application point of view.